I used to believe that the most reliable way to protect something valuable was to keep it unseen, not hidden out of fear, not buried because it couldn't survive the light, simply untouched. There is a difference. People often imagine distance as loneliness, but they misunderstand what distance actually does. Distance is structure. It gives shape to things that would otherwise be distorted by constant observation. It allows something to exist without being translated into everyone else's language. I've lived that way for longer than I can remember. Carefully, deliberately, never withholding because I wanted to appear mysterious. Never remaining quiet because I enjoyed uncertainty. I simply learned that not everything meaningful becomes clearer when it's explained. Some things become smaller. The moment they're forced into words, they lose dimensions they once carried naturally. So I stopped trying. I let people understand whatever version of me made sense to them. If they believed I was distant, fine. If they believed I was difficult to read, also fine. If they assumed silence meant emptiness instead of depth, that was never my responsibility to correct. People rarely see what stands directly in front of them. They mostly see reflections of themselves. Every conversation becomes another mirror. Every opinion, another projection. Every conclusion, another attempt to make the unfamiliar feel predictable. I stopped expecting accuracy a long time ago, not because I became cynical, because I became realistic. Understanding isn't something most people pursue. Recognition is. They don't want to discover who you actually are. They want to discover whether you fit into a category they've already created. It's easier that way, safer, faster, less demanding. Maybe that's why I've always found genuine understanding so rare. It requires patience, not passive patience, ontif patience, the kind that resists rushing towards certainty, the kind that leaves space for another person to exist without immediately assigning meaning to every movement they make. Very few people have that. Even fewer realize they don't. I had accepted that reality, accepted it so completely that I stopped looking for exceptions. Life became quieter after that. Predictable, not boring, predictable. I knew how interactions would unfold before they happened. I knew which conversations would stay on the surface. I knew when someone was listening only long enough to prepare their next response. I knew when curiosity was actually judgment disguised as interest. Parts repeat. People repeat. The details change. The structure rarely does. And once you notice structure, surprises become increasingly uncommon. At least, that's what I believed. Then something shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once. Nothing extraordinary announced itself. No moment arrived demanding attention. No unmistakable event divided life into before and after. Looking back now, I couldn't even tell you exactly when it started. That's what makes it difficult to explain. It didn't begin with words. It began with absence. An absence of friction I had grown so accustomed to that I stopped realizing it was there. Normally, every interaction requires adjustment. You measure your language. You simplify complicated thoughts. You decide which parts of yourself will only create unnecessary confusion. It's almost automatic, like translating yourself into a language everyone else is comfortable speaking. Most people don't even notice they're doing it. I always noticed. Every sentence carried calculation, not manipulation. Calculation, there's a difference. Manipulation changes the truth. Calculation chooses how much of the truth can survive another person's perspective. It's exhausting. Necessary, perhaps, but exhausting. Then one day, Ape realized I hadn't been translating. The thought arrived long after the moment had already passed. I remember sitting with it afterward, replaying the conversation again and again, reaching for the point where I should have filtered myself, searching for the place where instinct usually interrupted me. It never came. For the first time in years, I had spoken without constantly measuring whether my thoughts would survive being misunderstood. Not because I suddenly became fearless, because misunderstanding didn't feel inevitable. That was new, almost unsettling. I told myself it was temporary, an accident, one unusually comfortable exchange, nothing more. After all, everyone occasionally experiences moments where communication feels effortless. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. So, I dismissed it, or at least AB tried to. But the mind has an interesting habit. When something truly matters, it refuses to stay dismissed. It returns, quietly, not demanding attention, simply waiting until you're honest enough to notice it again. That's exactly what happened. Days passed, then more conversations, different topics, different moods, different circumstances. Yet the same strange ease remained. It wasn't agreement. We didn't always think the same way. Sometimes our conclusions couldn't have been more different. But disagreement never created distance. That's what confused me. Usually people mistake disagreement for disconnection. They feel challenged, misunderstood, threatened. They begin defending positions they weren't even certain about moments earlier. The conversation stops becoming exploration, it becomes preservation, an argument over identity disguised as an exchange of ideas. That never happened here. Difference existed without conflict. Perspective existed without competition. Silence existed without discomfort. I found myself paying attention, not to you, to myself, specifically to who I became whenever we occupied the same conversation. I was quieter, not because I had less to say, because I no longer felt urgency to prove that what I said mattered. There's an unusual peace that arrives when you stop performing understanding and simply allow it to exist. Most conversations contain invisible pressure, pressure to impress, pressure to explain, pressure to defend, pressure to maintain an image that remains consistent from beginning to end. Without realizing it, everyone becomes an actor, playing themselves, editing themselves, protecting themselves. Some become so skilled they eventually forget the original version beneath the performance. I never wanted that, which is probably why I withdrew more often than I participated. Distant may appear lonely from the outside, but pretending is lonelier, much lonelier. At least distance leaves you intact. Pretending slowly separates you from yourself. I refused to make that trade, even if it meant remaining misunderstood. Even if it meant becoming difficult to reach, I accepted the cost until somehow, without asking, without negotiation, without any visible effort, you reached a place I hadn't intended anyone to reach. Not emotionally, that's too simple a description. Emotion changes, it rises, falls, transforms. What happened here felt different, more foundational, like someone recognizing the architecture beneath a building instead of admiring the walls. That kind of recognition is rare, not because the structure is hidden, because very few people think to look beneath appearances. Most become fascinated by presentation. Almost nobody studies foundation. You did, without announcing it, without making a point of it, without ever saying, I understand you. Maybe that's why I believed it. People who genuinely understand rarely need to declare it. Their understanding appears elsewhere, in timing, in restraint, in what they choose not to interrupt. I started noticing little things. Moments most people would ignored, the exact pause before responding. The way certain silences remained untouched instead of being hurried into conversation. The strange accuracy of observations made without excessive confidence. Nothing dramatic, nothing cinematic, just precision. And precision has always impressed me more than intensity. Anyone can become intense. Emotion makes intensity easy. Precision requires attention, discipline, presence. The more I noticed these details, the more another realization quietly formed beneath them. I wasn't becoming more open. That's the interesting part. People often assume closeness happens because someone decides to reveal more of themselves. That isn't always true. Sometimes nothing new is revealed. Sometimes another person simply notices what has always been visible. There's an enormous difference. One requires exposure, the other requires perception. Exposure depends on courage, perception depends on awareness. I don't think I became easier to understand. I think you were simply paying attention to things most people never considered important. And once I recognized that, something inside me relaxed. Not completely, just enough. Enough for thoughts to arrive without immediately questioning whether they should remain private. Enough for silence to stop functioning as armor. Enough for stillness to become shared instead of solitary. I hadn't expected that. Truthfully, AB hadn't believed it was possible. Not anymore. Life teaches strange lessons. One of them is that repeated disappointment eventually disguises itself as wisdom. You stop expecting certain experiences, not because they're impossible, because they become statistically unlikely. Hope feels inefficient. Expectation feels unnecessary. Acceptance feels practical. So you adapt. You convince yourself you've become realistic when perhaps you've simply become accustomed to absence. Then something appears that doesn't fit your conclusions. Not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently enough that reality begins arguing against everything certainty once believed. That's the position I found myself in, not convinced of anything, simply unable to ignore accumulating evidence. Evidence that maybe, just maybe, some forms of understanding still exist, not the loud kind. Not the dramatic kind people write stories about, the quiet kind, the kind that never asks to be noticed because it isn't trying to prove itself. It simply remains steady, accurate, bosun. And strangely enough, those qualities are much harder to dismiss than grand declarations ever could be, because grand declarations depend on emotion. Steadiness depends on character. Anyone can promise permanence. Very few naturally embody it. I think that's what unsettled me the most. Nothing about this demanded belief. Nothing insisted on importance. Nothing attempted to become significant, yet significance kept emerging anyway, slowly, naturally, like dawn arriving without asking whether the world is ready for morning. You don't notice dawn all at once. You notice shadows becoming softer, edges becoming clearer, darkness surrendering without resistance. Only afterward do you realize the entire landscape has changed. Maybe that's why I struggled to identify when this truly began, because transformation rarely announces itself. It accumulates, one quiet moment at a time, one unnoticed adjustment after another, until eventually you wake up inside a reality that feels different and can't remember exactly when it stopped being the one you used to know. The strange thing about change is that it almost never feels like change while it's happening. People imagine transformation as something dramatic, a single decision, a defining conversation, a moment so obvious that it divides your life into before and after. But the deepest changes rarely arrive like that. They don't interrupt your life. They weave themselves into it so quietly that by the time you notice them, they've already become part of the way you think. That's what happened here. There wasn't one conversation I could point to, no sentence that suddenly explained everything, no confession, no revelation, just a growing awareness that my internal world no longer functioned exactly the way it used to. At first, I questioned myself, not because I believed I was wrong, because I needed to know whether I was seeing something that actually existed or simply creating meaning where none belonged. The mind is capable of remarkable precision. It's also capable of remarkable illusion. I've always known that, which is why I've never trusted my first conclusion about anything important. I observe. Then I observe myself observing. Then I question both. Only after enough time passes do I allow certainty to exist. It's a slow process, sometimes painfully slow, but it protects truth from becoming whatever emotion wants it to be. So I waited, I watched, I let days become weeks without trying to define what I was experiencing. And the more distance I gave it, less it disappeared. Usually, things lose intensity when you stop feeding them attention. They fade, they settle, they return to proportion. This didn't. It remained exactly where I had left it, unaffected by whether I focused on it or ignored it, almost as though it wasn't asking for attention in the first place. It simply existed, steady, unmoving bat, enough to let me arrive at it in my own time. That's when I realized something that unsettled me more than I expected. This wasn't built on excitement. Excitement fades. It depends on novelty. Once novelty disappears, excitement usually follows. This felt almost untouched by novelty. If anything, more familiar it became, the more accurate it felt. That's unusual. Most people become less interesting the longer you know them. Not because they change, because assumptions replace observation. You stop seeing the person. You begin seeing the version you've already decided they are. Certainty slowly replaces curiosity. Attention becomes habit. Eventually, you're responding less to who they are and more to the memory you've built around them. I've watched that happen countless times. Relationships don't always fail because people stop caring. Sometimes they fail because people stop looking. They think they've already seen enough. They believe understanding is complete. But understanding is never complete. Human beings are constantly unfolding. Every day reveals another layer, another contradiction, another possibility. The moment someone believes they've finished discovering another person, they usually stop discovering them altogether. I never wanted that. Maybe that's why I've always kept people slightly beyond certainty. Not to create mystery, to preserve accuracy. I wanted to keep being seen as I actually was, not as someone's final conclusion. But something curious happened with you. The more familiar you became, less I felt reduced. Instead of becoming smaller inside your understanding, AB somehow felt larger. Not because you imagined more than what existed, because you kept leaving room for what hadn't revealed itself yet. You never spoke to me like a finished story. You spoke to me like a chapter still being written. There's a quiet respect in that, one I don't think most people recognize. Everyone says they accept change. Very few actually do. Most people accept predictable change, the kind they can anticipate, control, explain. But real people don't evolve in straight lines. Sometimes growth looks like contradiction. Sometimes healing resembles distance. Sometimes clarity arrives disguised as uncertainty. If someone truly sees you, they have to allow those contradictions without rushing to resolve them. You did. You never seemed threatened by complexity. You never needed consistency for your understanding to remain intact. That mattered more than I realized, because consistency can be performed, truth can't, and somewhere along the way, AB stopped feeling like I needed to perform stability around you. If I was uncertain, AB could simply be uncertain. If I changed my mind, nothing collapsed. If I couldn't explain something, conversation didn't demand immediate answers. There was space, real space, the kind that doesn't pressure you into becoming understandable before you're ready. I'd forgotten spaces like that could exist. Maybe I never truly experienced one before. People often confuse being heard with being understood. They're not the same. Someone can hear every word you say and still miss everything you meant. Understanding happens somewhere deeper than language. It lives beneath vocabulary, beneath explanation, sometimes beneath thought itself. It's difficult to describe, like recognizing a melody before you've consciously identified the song. Your mind knows first, words arrive later. That's what this began to resemble. Not communication, recognition. Recognition doesn't ask permission. It doesn't introduce itself politely. It simply arrives with the strange confidence of something that's been true longer than you've been aware of it. That's why it feels inevitable, not because destiny demands it, because reality eventually becomes impossible to overlook. I've been wondering lately whether people spend too much of their lives searching for certainty when what they're actually looking for is resonance. There's a difference. Certainty answers questions. Resonance changes the questions you're asking. Certainty tells you what something is. Resonance quietly shows you why it matters. One satisfies the mind. The other reorganizes it. That's the part I hadn't prepared for. Nothing about this merely answered something inside me. It rearranged something, subtly, without permission, without resistance. The framework remained the same, but the relationships between its parts shifted. It's difficult explaining internal architecture. People assume thoughts exist individually. They don't. Every belief connects to another. Every memory supports something larger. Every conclusion rests upon dozens that came before it. Chant one foundational piece, and eventually everything connected to it adjusts. That's what I began noticing. Not dramatic, emotional shifts, structural movement, the kind that's almost invisible until enough time has passed to reveal its consequences. I started approaching conversations differently. Not only with you, with everyone, listenings more carefully, interrupting less, questioning assumptions I once accepted without hesitation. You hadn't taught me these things directly. Your presence had simply reminded me they were possible. That realization stayed with me. Influence is usually loud. People try to change each other, offer advice, provide solutions, pliff growth before understanding. This wasn't like that. Nothing was demanded, nothing was suggested, nothing was corrected. And yet, something changed anyway. I think that's the purest form of influence, the kind that never tries to reshape you. It simply exists honestly enough that you begin examining yourself with greater honesty, too. I've rarely encountered that. Maybe because honesty itself has become so performative, people announce authenticity before demonstrating it. They speak endlessly about vulnerability, while carefully controlling every vulnerable moment. Everything becomes presentation, even sincerity, especially sincerity. Eventually, it becomes difficult to distinguish genuine openness from carefully managed transparency. I stopped trying. If something was real, time would reveal it. Time always does. Performance gets tired. Truth doesn't. Truth becomes quieter, more consistent, less interested in proving itself. And consistency has a strange effect. It slowly dissolves suspicion, not because trust suddenly appears, because the reasons for distrust quietly disappear. That's a very different process. Trust isn't built through promises. It's built through repetition. Hundreds of ordinary moments aligning with what they quietly suggested from the beginning. Nothing dramatic, nothing impressive, just reliable. There's beauty in reliability that people often overlook. The world celebrates intensity. Intensity captures attention. Reliability changes lives. Anyone can create unforgettable moments. Very few create environments where forgetting to protect yourself becomes natural. I think that's what surprised me most. Not that I felt understood, that I gradually stopped expecting misunderstanding. There's an enormous difference between those two experiences. One is positive, the other is transformative. Feeling understood is comforting. No longer anticipating misunderstanding changes the way your entire mind moves through conversation. You hesitate less. You defend less. You explain less. Not because you've become careless, because you've stopped preparing for battles that never arrive. I didn't notice how exhausting that constant preparation had become until it disappeared. Perhaps that's how we recognize burdens we've carried too long, not by their weight while we're carrying them, by the incredible lightness we feel once they're finally gone. I wonder how many parts of ourselves we mistake for personality when they're actually adaptations. Maybe we aren't naturally guarded. Maybe we simply learned caution. Maybe we aren't naturally distant. Maybe distance once kept something important alive. Maybe we aren't difficult to understand. Maybe we've just spent years speaking to people who were never really listening. Those thoughts have stayed with me, not because they answer everything, because they invite better questions. And lately, AB found myself valuing better questions far more than comfortable answers. And wetters create endings. Questions create movement. This, whatever this continues becoming, hasn't given me many answers, but it has changed the quality of the questions I ask myself. And somehow, that feels far more important. Because the right question doesn't simply help you understand another person. Sometimes it quietly introduces you to parts of yourself that had been waiting patiently and silently for someone to make you curious enough to finally look. There comes a point when curiosity quietly transforms into responsibility. Not responsibility toward another person, responsibility toward the truth. Because once you've seen something clearly enough, pretending not to see it becomes its own kind of dishonesty. I've reached that point more than once in my life. Usually it arrives after months of observation, after every alternative explanation has been tested, after every convenient conclusion has been questioned. Only then do I allow myself to admit what has been obvious all along, not because I'm afraid of truth, because truth deserves patience. Anything worth believing should survive examination. Anything real should become clearer the longer you look at it, not blur beneath closer attention. That's the standard I've always lived by. Most things fail it. First impressions fail it. Excitement fails it. Admiration often fails it. Even certainty can fail it. when certainty arrives too quickly. I've watched people convince themselves they had found something extraordinary simply because it felt unfamiliar. Newness has a way of disguising itself as significance. Time usually reveals the difference. That's why I've never trusted beginnings. Beginnings are persuasive. They speak in possibility instead of reality. They promise more than they can prove. It's the middle that interests me. The quiet stretch where attention is no longer fueled by excitement, where people stop trying to impress each other, where effort becomes habit, where masks grow heavy enough to fall on their own. That's where reality begins. That's where I began paying closer attention to us, not because something became more dramatic, because nothing did. The absence of drama started telling its own story. Most connections depend on momentum. They require constant reassurance, constant interaction, constant proof that something meaningful is still happening. The moment conversation slows, people panic. They mistake silence for distance, distance for loss, loss for the end. I've never understood that. If something only survives constant attention, was it ever stable to begin with? Real things don't disappear the moment they're left alone. They remain. Like mountains, like oceans, like gravity, they don't announce themselves every morning just to remind you they still exist. They simply continue existing, whether you're looking at them or not. That's what this slowly began resembling, not a fire demanding to be fed, more like the horizon, always there, sometimes hidden by weather, never actually gone. I found that strangely comforting. Not because certainty finally arrived, because uncertainty stopped feeling threatening. There's a strange freedom in no longer needing immediate conclusions. The world teaches us to define everything quickly. Friend, stranger, love, coincidence, beginning, ending, as though naming something grants control over it. I've never believed that. Names describe, they rarely explain. You can label the ocean. The label doesn't reduce its depth. You can identify a constellation. The stars remain unimaginably distant. Definitions satisfy language. Reality remains larger than vocabulary. Perhaps that's why I resisted naming this for so long. Not because I feared what it might become, because I didn't want language to shrink something I was still learning to observe. Observation requires openness. Slaves often end observation. The moment we think we know what something is, we unconsciously stop looking. I refuse to stop looking, not only at you, at myself, because if this was changing the way I perceived connection, then it was inevitably changing the one perceiving it. That realization stayed with me. We often imagine people entering our lives, but perhaps what really happens is subtler than that. Perhaps they enter our perception, and once perception changes, world itself appears different. Nothing external has to move. One shift in awareness can rearrange an entire reality. I've experienced that before, through books, through places, through certain moments of solitude. A single idea can permanently alter the way you interpret everything that follows. After that, you never truly return to the person you were before understanding it. Maybe people can do the same, not because they replace your identity, because they reveal perspectives your identity couldn't reach alone. If that's true, then perhaps the most meaningful people aren't the ones who complete us. They're the ones who expand us. Completion suggests something was missing. Expansion suggests something already existed, waiting for room to become larger. That feels closer to the truth. You haven't filled an emptiness. You've altered dimensions. There's a difference. One depends on absence. The other depends on possibility. I've never liked stories that describe connection as rescue. No one should become another person's oxygen. No one should carry the impossible responsibility of completing another human being. That's too much to ask, too much to become, too much to survive. Healthy connections don't replace foundations. They strengthen them. They don't erase individuality. They deepen it. That's why this has never frightened me in the way dependency would. What unsettles me isn't losing myself. It's discovering more of myself than I realized was there. That's an entirely different experience. Growth can feel strangely similar to uncertainty. Both require leaving familiar territory. Both ask you to release versions of yourself that once felt permanent. Both invite realities you can't fully predict. No wonder people confuse them. Standing at the edge of genuine growth often feels almost identical to standing at the edge of loss. Something is ending. Something is beginning. Your mind can't always distinguish between the two. It simply recognizes transition. Perhaps that's why I've spent so much time observing instead of deciding. Observation creates space. Space allows truth to emerge without pressure. Pressure has always distorted important things. Force a flower open, you destroy it. Force understanding, you replace discovery with assumption. Force closeness, you create performance instead of trust. The deepest things I've ever known all arrived slowly. Not because they were weak, because they were rooted. Roots don't rush. They grow downward long before anything visible appears above the surface. People celebrate blossoms. Nature prioritizes foundations. Maybe we should do the same. I've been thinking about foundations more lately, not buildings. People, what actually allows someone to remain themselves while becoming close to another person? It's a question I don't hear often. Most conversations focus on compatibility, shared interests, similar personalities, common goals. Those things matter. But they aren't foundations. Foundations reveal themselves under pressure. Can two people remain honest when misunderstanding appears? Can they remain curious instead of defensive? Can silence exist without becoming punishment? Can difference exist without becoming division? Those questions matter more to me than agreement ever could. Agreement is easy. Understanding is difficult. Understanding asks something deeper. It asks you to protect another person's reality, even when it differs from your own, not to adopt it, not to imitate it, simply to make room for it. That kind of respect has become increasingly rare, perhaps because certainty has become fashionable. Everyone wants to be right. Very few want to become accurate. Accuracy requires revision. Revision requires humility. Humility requires admitting that another person's perspective might reveal something your own cannot. I've always admired that quality, not because it makes someone agreeable, because it makes growth possible. Growth doesn't happen inside certainty. It happens inside openness. Somewhere along the way, AP realized, you never asked me to become more understandable. You never asked me to become less complicated. You never suggested I explain myself differently so things would feel easier. Instead, you allowed complexity to remain complex. That's a remarkable gift. Not simplifying another person, not because simplicity is wrong, because unnecessary simplification often becomes distortion. Some truths require patience. Some emotions require silence. Some realizations require time, measured in seasons rather than conversations. I've stopped expecting immediate clarity. Life has shown me that clarity often arrives quietly. long after the questions that invited it have already changed. Maybe that's why I no longer feel the urgency I once did. Not because I care less, because depth has its own rhythm. You can't hurry something becoming real. You can only interrupt it. So I haven't interrupted this. I've simply continued paying attention, continued noticing, continued allowing reality enough space to reveal itself without demanding it arrive according to my timeline. And the more I do, more one quiet realization continues returning, not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently enough that ignoring it would require more effort than accepting it. Some people pass through your life like conversations, meaningful while they last, then gently carried away by time. Others resemble seasons. They change something while they're present. Eventually, another season arrives. The landscape remembers, continues. Then, very rarely, someone becomes something else entirely. Not a conversation, not a season. More like direction. You don't think about direction every moment you're walking, yet it quietly shapes every step you take. It doesn't demand attention. It simply influences where every path eventually leads. That's the strange place I've found myself standing, not wondering whether you matter. That question disappeared long ago. The quieter question now is different. How deeply can one person's presence reshape another person's understanding without either of them intending it? I don't know the answer. Maybe no one does. But I know enough to recognize when a question deserves to remain open. Some answers become smaller the moment they're spoken too soon. Some truths become stronger by being lived before they are explained. Perhaps this is one of them. Perhaps the most meaningful transformations never announce themselves as transformation at all. They simply continue, one quiet realization after another, until eventually you look back at the person you used to be and realize that somewhere between all the ordinary moments, all the unnoticed pauses, and all the conversations that never demanded anything from either of you, your understanding of yourself became larger than it had ever been before.